Well, hey, all you wiretappers, welcome back to the studio of Gangland Wire. I have a particularly interesting guest today, something we have not talked about, the Boston Mafia, the Angiulo family. I butchered that one as usual, but we'll get on to that, guys. You know how I am. Don't forget, I'm Gary Jenkins, retired Kansas City, Missouri Police Intelligence Detective, and I have this podcast, Gangland Wire, and we are going to go deep into the Boston Mafia. It's not really been touched a lot, so Ian, welcome.
Good to be here, and we are definitely going to get into some wiretaps. So it's
And
like
the
I'm in a replay.
wiretaps, the installation of some microphones. It's the most fascinating thing I have ever heard about is the installation of microphones. I always like that. We've got a great story in Kansas City about doing that
Mm,
FBI agents wouldn't talk about for years. Although
yep.
I found out, Ian, I found out that in the Chicago Tribune, when they had the trials, it came out at trial how they did this one really tricky installation that these
Mm,
guys were all saying, "Oh, we can't give away our techniques. We can't give away our
yep. Yep.
techniques." And they don't like to give away their techniques, do they?
No, 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 no.
they
Very careful about that. In
they
fact, one
do
of the
not.
FBI agents I interviewed told me that they would keep the whole operation kind of in the dark. Like the folks who were taking the pictures didn't
Yeah,
know necessarily what was going on in the audio side, and the folks who were doing the surveillance didn't, everyone was kind of separated from each other so that even if they were called to testify, you know, they knew as little as possible about what was going on.
yeah, that's the FBI. It used to drive us crazy because we worked with them, and but now I understand why. I really
Yep.
get it. It wasn't I was going to give up any secrets to the mob. It was that I couldn't testify as to how they did something. So that's
Right.
uh,
Right.
uh, you live and learn, I guess. You live and learn. We used to get this one FBI agent a bunch of beer, and we'd get done with their surveillance, and he'd start talking a little bit. So, because we wanted to know what else is going on here.
Right. Right.
Anyhow, so Ian Coss, you have done the Big Dig, a
Yeah.
uh, podcast about the tunnel into the Boston, central Boston area, which then became a greens on the top of it. It's really cool.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about that podcast, The Big Dig.
Yeah, yeah. So just for context, this was the previous project that I did. Um, and yeah, it was all about, so I grew up in Massachusetts. I grew up hearing about this thing called the Big Dig. But I think folks, when I travel around this country, people, if you're around listening to the news in the 90s, 2000s, you probably heard about this thing called the Big Dig. It was kind of a notorious boondoggle fiasco type project at the time where, it was over budget and behind schedule and
Yeah.
there were investigations and people resigned. And it was kind of this never ending saga. And so I got curious, now 15, 20 years after the fact, how did that tunnel work out? And what were we doing under the ground there anyway? What was the point of this thing? And trying to tell the larger story of that project. And it was really interesting to kind of put it in a bigger context and see how, in many ways, this thing that had been ridiculed at the time did in fact transform the city. So that was the last project. There's probably a little mafia angle in there if you went looking for it. There was certainly some corruption and organized crime involved in that project. But we did not go too deep on that particular angle for that story. But
Yeah, where there's unions and there's construction, there's usually some kind of mafia influence, some way.
right. One of the interesting things I learned, so I'm here today to talk about this new series that's really more about the world of gambling, lotteries, and how that whole world of gaming sort of went from a mafia operation to a state operation.
State operation.
And
Yeah.
one of the interesting things I learned about Boston in researching this project is that, just demographically, Italian Americans were always outnumbered here in Boston. In terms of the ethnic groups, the Irish were always the dominant group here, and that's different. If you compare it to Providence, Rhode Island, New York City, a lot of other cities, and one of the consequences of that is that the Italian mafia in Boston was not able to control some of those bigger institutions of the city, like the labor unions, like waste, construction, politics, the FBI. Those were harder nuts to crack. And so gambling and numbers in particular was really the bread and butter of the Boston Mafia for decades. And that kind of sets up a particular kind of stakes for that whole story, the way it plays out here.
Interesting. Now, these guys, they had a headquarters at
That's
was
right.
it 98 Prince Street in the North End. So
Yes.
describe the North End to my guys.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. We've got a little North End ourselves, and our
Sure.
own social club is called the Trap. I found
Okay.
that fascinating because Angelo called his the Mouse Trap. So
That's
talk
right.
about that North End and the
Yeah.
Trap, the Mouse Trap.
Now, have you been to the North End of Boston before?
I
Can you
have not.
pretty
I
well?
read the description of it, and I can envision it, but I have not been there.
Okay. So if you've ever, done the touristy things in Boston, maybe you've come to, I don't know, historic Faneuil Hall or the waterfront or the Boston Common. There's all these kind of iconic sites right around downtown. And then just north of all that, there's this neighborhood, and it's kind of tucked away between, in fact, it used to be cut off by a highway, by a 6-lane elevated highway. And then it was sort of between the highway and the water. And it was called the North End, still called the North End. And it was sort of it was Little Italy for a long time. It was really the neighborhood where a lot of immigrants landed first. And so for a lot of the 20th century, that was where a lot of the Italians arrived. And it's interesting when you go to downtown Boston, even to this day, there'll be the finance district and the tall buildings and city hall. And then you cross over this divide where and you're in the North End, and suddenly it's all low buildings. Everything feels kind of crammed close together, brick and old stone and historic stuff. The streets are really narrow. That's where you go for your cannolis, for your calamari, for all that stuff. And so it still has that flavor. What I would say though is, now the highway is gone. Now that neighborhood is a little bit more integrated with the rest of the city. But if you go back to the 60s and 70s, it really was like a little island, cut off from the rest of the city up against the water. Its own little kind of fiefdom where Gennaro Angiulo really he held court, and that was his domain, and he felt very safe there. That's something all the FBI agents I talked to for this story, they told me that anything that happened in the North End, Angiulo would find out about it, and that was his greatest protection.
Yeah, really. I mean, that's the way it is in Kansas City and probably around Mulberry Street and Little Italy and in Manhattan. Any of these old, small, primarily Italian enclaves, you
Yep.
don't go into that as an outsider without somebody noticing what you're doing.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of ingenuity to penetrate those. It's really tough.
Yeah.
I read that this thing has been occupied since like 1602 or 1603. This
Right.
particular area, it's really old.
Yeah, the North End is one of the oldest parts of Boston. It's where Paul Revere's house was. So, the historic ride of Paul Revere. He was a silversmith. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that is the oldest standing building, or maybe the oldest home in the city of Boston is the Paul Revere house. And it is still there in the North End. So that just shows, that neighborhood has gone through waves and waves.
Yeah.
It has been many things. It was once an Irish neighborhood, but in its current incarnation, it's the Italian neighborhood.
Interesting. So now, Gennaro or Jerry Angiulo, he was a Boston Mafia kingpin, if you will, but he wasn't really the boss.
Right.
I've always wondered about this. What did you learn about his relationship to the Providence, Rhode Island and Raymond Patriarca and the New England mob? How did that work?
Right. Yeah. So the counterintuitive thing about the New England Mafia is that it was never headquartered in Boston, right? Boston is the economic, cultural, everything capital of the region, but that is not the headquarters of the mob. And it's partly related to what I was saying before about just the demographics of the city. Providence, Rhode Island is heavily, and for a long time has been heavily Italian. And so the Italian mafia there was much more enmeshed in city politics, in state politics, in all the institutions of that area. And so historically, it was Raymond Patriarca, in the 60s and 70s, who was the boss of the New England Mafia. And Gennaro Angiulo, up in the North End, in the much bigger city of Boston, he was the underboss. And so everything he did, he paid tribute and everything up to Raymond Patriarca and was underneath him, in that whole order.
Interesting. Do you have any idea how they got together? Did Patriarch? I think I read Patriarch just kind of took notice of this guy that seemed to be making money down in Boston.
Yeah, so I think Jerry Angiulo put himself on the map. He, what everyone tells me about Jerry Angiulo is that he was a great businessman. He was not physically intimidating or menacing. In fact, he was very small. By some accounts, he was just 5'5",
Wow.
and would wear lifts in his shoes, to give himself a little extra height. Um, and so he was not, he did not come up, and gain notice because he was strong or forceful. It was always because he was smart. His grandfather was I guess, a great card player. His mother ran a grocery store in the North End, so he learned numbers and bookkeeping and management. And that's really where he distinguished himself, was in running the numbers operation. So over the course of the 50s and 60s, Gennaro starts to take control of and consolidate different numbers games that were being run in the city and combine them into a larger operation. So just for like very brief context on numbers, this is an illegal daily lottery game, It's basically the same idea as if you go to the corner store and buy, excuse me, buy your Powerball ticket, or your Massachusetts State Lottery ticket. Except it was run, illegally by the mafia. There was a 3 or 4 digit number drawn every day, usually identified actually not by a drawing, but the number was generated by horse racing figures. So it would be certain digits out of certain race results at certain racetracks would determine, okay, the first digit of that number is 3, the second digit of that number is 4, the third digit, et cetera, and that's our daily winning number. And so these numbers games had existed for decades at that point, in New York, in Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, cities all over. But Gennaro Angiulo had a special gift, really, for managing these games, consolidating these games into what is, by some accounts, the most profitable mafia-run gambling operation in the entire country. And that's what puts him on the map.
Wow. Yeah, the numbers game. I mean, anytime you have a large cohort, a large population of poor people, they
Mm-hmm.
all are willing to risk 50 cents, quarter, a buck, even maybe, and the
Mm-hmm.
chance they might win several $100s.
Yep.
And those quarters and those 50-cent pieces back in the day, they added up to big money because everybody played the lottery.
Yeah, yeah. And one interesting detail that maybe you'll appreciate is, so in the 50s, there are these things called the Kefauver hearings.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe you've talked about this on the show before. There was all this attention around organized crime in the 50s and 60s. The FBI, under RFK, was starting to pay more attention to it. There's more scrutiny and pressure.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways in which Angiulo actually kind of got his foot in the door was that at some point there were one of these hearings in Boston, and a lot of the local bookmakers, there's all this kind of renewed scrutiny. And so some of the local bookmakers decided to just pause and stop running their games while these hearings were going on, kind of wait for the heat to pass over. And Angiulo just sort of moved in and kept running the games and was able to able to kind of pick up business that way. Or sometimes if every once in a while, if the wrong number hit and enough people had bet on it, it would actually break the bank. Like the bank would have to pay out more money than it had taken in. And that was another case where, like, if somebody went belly up, Angiulo would move in and take over that territory. And so he did this over many years. And again, was just so shrewd at running the game that he never got caught. And his bank never got broken. He was very careful about even like monitoring the day's bets as they came in, just to make sure that he wasn't getting overexposed on any given number. And he had ways of kind of hedging against that. And
Interesting.
so again, it was a very sophisticated operation. He had something like a dozen offices spread around the Boston region. So, he had the headquarters you're mentioning, like the nerve center in the North End. But then they had regional offices, like where I live, in Medford was one of the regional offices. I'm maybe 5, 7 miles away from downtown, and a bunch of others scattered out really into even towns you'd consider suburbs more than the metro area. Um, and yeah, so gathering bets and dollars and numbers from a huge area.
Well, that generated a lot of cash money. He had to
Yeah,
have he
tens of
had to have
thousands of dollars
connections
a day.
with a bank. In the end, I know he ended up. There's a kind of a
Yeah,
famous case with the
yeah,
Boston Central Bank where he was washing a lot of that money, and they were basically helping.
yes, yes, he did.
So I guess now, numbers is numbers, but he didn't expand on into sports bookmaking. I have to assume that since he's now the gambling czar and the mafia historically, that's what's the mother's milk here in Kansas City has been sports bookmaking. So did he expand on into sports bookmaking then?
It's interesting. So one of the people I interviewed was a federal prosecutor named Ernie Danisco, who prosecuted the Angiulo case. He told me that um, Jerry hated sports betting. He did not
Uh,
like sports betting because there was risk involved. And
yeah.
basically on any given weekend, the house could lose. If the wrong team wins, and and he just didn't like that risk. It also generated more legal risk, right? Because when people get into sports betting, with illegal sports betting specifically, they're often betting on credit, sometimes large amounts, getting in over their heads. And that's when, people, if you're running out of time, you have nowhere else to turn. That's when you go to the FBI, right? So this prosecutor I interviewed, he was like, yeah, we had a saying that it's like every Friday, that was our day to make mafia cases because some poor sucker would, come in saying that, he'd run out of time on, he'd on this all this money he owed, right? And so with with the numbers racket, you both you minimize the risk, the financial risk, because if you're balancing it right, the house basically cannot lose. And then you minimize the legal risk because everybody it's a game based on scale, right? People are betting 5 cents, 10 cents, 25 cents at a time, maybe a dollar, a few dollars. You're not getting in so over your head, that you're going to feel like you need to go to the authorities. So
Interesting.
from what I understand, he did very little sports betting. It was actually, I'm sure you're familiar with Whitey Bulger,
Uh-huh.
the Irish gangster who was a contemporary of Angiulo's and he kind of figures into the story of his
Yeah.
downfall as well. Whitey Bulger supposedly ran more sports betting, and Angiulo really specialized in numbers. That was his game.
I'll be darn interesting. But now he's got a mafia crew under him, if you will, because he's an underboss, and
Yep.
he has to have a capo or two, and then soldiers and associates under that. So what else were those guys doing? Are they doing? Do you have a crew that was doing swag, doing truck hijackings? You have a crew, you have some people doing some loan sharking and different
Mhm.
things like that. They develop all those other periphery mafia, historically mafia rackets
Right.
underneath him.
I'll admit I'm not. My research is really focused on the numbers side of their business,
Numbers.
so I'm not as familiar um, with everything else. I know that in the final case against the Angiulos, the three charges involved were gambling, loan sharking, and murder. And the violence that they did carry out, the murders and attempted murder, was either against rivals, or involved, you know, people who had gotten in over their head and they're worried they might testify. Um, so from everything I understand, their bread and butter was the numbers. And so a lot of their staff, their team was really focused around that. They did also run some casino nights, card games around town. And like I said, loan sharking was certainly part of it. But I don't know. I did not come across much about, other kinds of robbery or other crimes.
Interesting.
Which
I noticed.
again, I think so much of it is of his personality comes down to this risk aversion. He was
Uh,
extremely cautious, and that's how he was able to kind of remain untouchable for decades in Boston, because he did not, carry out brazen crimes. It was really this kind of slow churn of the numbers game.
Interesting. He had a bunch of brothers, which kind of helps. He got blood family helping run all this thing, and he had a whole bunch of brothers. Now,
Five of them, I
uh,
believe.
I think one of them even had one of these offices somewhere down the street from where his office was. So, tell us
Yep.
about his blood family. They had to be a big part of this.
Yeah. So Jerry is the second oldest of the brothers, and that was part of the way he controlled the game, is that all the really important stuff that involved handling large amounts of money, that was all carried out by him and his brothers. There was one brother in particular, Frankie, who lived just across the street from the office, the headquarters, 98 Prince Street. Frankie lived just across the street. And once the FBI started surveilling them, they realized there was this very regular routine where every day Frankie would come down from his house, cross Prince Street, go into the office at 98 Prince, and then that's where he would, receive, bookmakers, people from the satellite offices would come in with money and betting slips. And Frankie would handle a lot of that day-to-day management. And then, but yeah, all the brothers were involved, and that was very, very important to kind of maintaining control over the whole thing.
So the organized crime squad in Boston, they then going to take on
Yeah.
this crew. They like put together a team just to focus on this crew and spend a lot of energy and a lot of effort to try to take down this crew that's just doing numbers. Now, there, of course, there were some murders going on, and if somebody, if Patriarca got crossways with somebody, he probably called Angelo, and he said, "Here, you take care of this," and
Yeah.
did some murders for Patriarca, I would
No, I mean, I
imagine.
don't mean to make it sound like they were totally benign, just, running numbers. The violence. I mean, as you know, like the only way illegal gambling works is if it's backed up by the threat of violence.
Yeah.
And so that was always part of it.
So
But yeah,
let's.
absolutely. Yeah. So the FBI gets interested, and part of the reason like you said, there was so much focus on this one family in this one operation is that it because it was so centralized in Angiulo and his brothers, what the FBI realized correctly early on was that if you could take down Angiulo, this whole operation would come down with him. That there was not a clear successor. The information and knowledge of the game was not distributed across a broad number of people. It was really this core group, and if they could bring him down, it would crumble. And
It
so
would
that was the
crumble.
goal.
Yeah, I believe that, and what I read was because, as you said early on, they were in such a minority in the Boston area, and the Irish they had everything sewed up. They had the politics, the connections to police and all that. The Irish really had sewed up. Jerry had a few connections in, but mainly it was the Irish. So they couldn't get much political protection because the Irish had it,
Yeah.
and they couldn't get much police protection. They got some, but not like to the extent that another mob family would able to get, like Chicago. Chicago owned the county court system. Chicago practically owned the city government.
Right.
They owned half the police department. It was they just didn't have that because they were the minority, and Irish had it all by then and had
And
developed their own mafia, the Winter Hill Gang. So it's
right, right.
it's a
And
little
that's one of
different.
the I don't know if it's an irony or if it makes perfect sense. One of the twists of the story is that like the team of FBI agents that ultimately,
Yeah.
takes on Angiulo, it's mostly Irish guys.
Yeah, well, I think it was
And,
four Irish and two Italians or something like that. I read it met the same demographics ethnicity as what was in Boston. That was interesting.
so yeah, this operation really gets underway in the late 70s. They start kind of surveilling and trying to find, probe for weaknesses. But the challenge they keep running into is the fact that anything that happens in the North End, and Julia hears about it. So I talked to and I should also just pause here to say, I know you mentioned earlier this book that we've both read. My research, my reporting on this was really heavily informed by this book called The Underboss by Gerard O'Neill, Gerard O'Neill and Dick Lair.
Dick Lair, yeah, there it is there.
Which maybe you can put a link to that in the show notes
Yeah,
as well, so folks
I
can
will.
check that out. So when I started working on this project, I had read this book, but also started reaching out to folks who I knew were involved. And I found this audio technician who is actually not interviewed in the book at the time of the case. He was not quite ready to go on the record. But he told me the story about how, and this is an Irish guy, his name's John Gill. He's in the podcast. He told me how he was used to going around. He described it as playing telephone man. He'd go into the neighborhood, he'd climb up, he'd act like a telephone man, install a camera or a bug or whatever it was, and just go about his business. And he remembers going into the North End and is like, it didn't work because they knew who the telephone man was, and it wasn't him.
Yeah.
And it certainly wasn't an Irish guy. Um, and they had the same problem where, at some point they installed a camera on a neighboring building that was looking down into the back entrance of 98th Street. And they thought, oh, this is great. We can see everybody who comes and goes. And one day in the middle of the night, Jerry Angiulo just steps out of the back door, looks up at the camera, and waves at.
That's a killer. When they do that, that's a killer.
So it was kind of like that, for the first couple of years they're working on this case. It's like every move they made, it's like they were being watched more so than watching. And so there were a couple breakthroughs that the team made right around 1979, 1980 that start to transform the case. Should I just keep going, or do you have a
Yeah,
question?
and one other thing I read is in that area, they could for like telephone lines, they had other apartments around there, and they could like make it look like a phone call was going somewhere else,
Yep.
and phone calls going out from somewhere else. So it was pretty sophisticated what he did to
Yep.
avoid the normal kinds of wiretaps and normal kind of surveillance that the FBI did, because they know that how the FBI works by now.
Right. Right.
So they were a tough nut to crack. One thing I read is they finally rigged up about 4 or 5 different cars with
That's
a
right.
camera in the grill, and then switched them out so they could get an idea about who was coming and going. And then understand when you have a mic on the inside, you have to know who's inside.
Right.
And identify voices. And so that camera will tell you who was going in and who was in there and who was out of there. But and they'd switch those cameras out, those cars all day long, off and on. So it
Yeah.
was really inventive. That now did you called him what? You called him a technician. He's a black bag guy. Your black bag guy that you talked
Sure.
to.
Yep.
Now, was he part of the break-in team?
Yeah. So I talked to two of the black bag guys.
Okay.
One was the audio technician, and one was actually the camera technician who did the camera car.
Okay.
Yeah, he described how they found these old like 68 Chevys because they had inline instead of a V6, it had an inline 4-cylinder or something. There was enough room under the hood to put the camera with the lens right up against the grill so you could get a clean shot. And that was grueling work. He described to me how so that whole camera setup, it took about 1 or 2 frames per second, and the battery on there could last for 1 day, just 24 hours, taking 1 frame per second and storing it, right? And so they had to swap out that car, like you mentioned, every single day. And the batteries for that were 6 Sears die-high like car batteries in the trunk of that car. Um, and so his for months, once they got this camera car set up, his routine was every day at 2 or 3 in the morning, you swap out the car, you take the car back to the FBI garage, you pull out those batteries, you charge the batteries, you take it back, and it was just round and round and round. He said one time those old batteries would give off fumes, and if you catch a bad spark, they'll blow
Yeah.
up in your face. So he said one time he had a battery blow up in his face, um, and yeah, he never made that mistake again. But
Crazy,
it was
crazy.
that kind of constant churn.
Yeah.
But then, like you said, once you've got that round the clock video surveillance outside, every person who comes and goes. The goal is to pair that with the audio so that okay, once those people go in, what are they talking about? Um, so yeah, the other technician I interviewed was this guy, John Gill, who was part of the break-in team. Um, and what they did is they went out, it was in the middle of the winter, it was in January, um, and it took them 4 tries. So as I recall, the first try, they went out on the street, um, and there were a lot of people hanging out late at night. They couldn't get close. They didn't want to be seen, so they called it off. The second try, they got pretty close, but then they're having radio trouble, so they called it off again. And of course, they had like a court. I think a judge had signed off on placing the bug. They had 30 days to do it, so they had to do it quickly. The third try, they get all the way to the door of 98 Prince Street, and it's sort of like a recessed entryway, right? And so they've got the little team in there, and they're ready to go in, but they hear voices inside.
Oh,
And so they're thinking, so they're trying to listen, figure out like,
yeah.
did somebody stay late? Is there somebody in there? And so they call it off again. By the fourth time, obviously they're starting to run out of time here. And excuse me, if I can get a sneeze. Sorry. By the fourth time, um, they go, and this time they actually have some of their agents tail Angiulo and some of his key lieutenants, follow them home so they know that everybody's left. So they get to the front door. Once again, they hear those voices inside. They listen for a second, and they figure, we just got to go for it. I don't know what this is. So they pick the lock. And actually, the guy interviewed told me, it was like, after all that, it was like a cheap builder's grade lock. Nothing special,
Yeah.
no alarms, um, no chains or anything. Just picked the lock, went in, and of course they're playing a talk radio station 24 inside the office, and that's the voices they were hearing.
Yeah.
Um, and he said once they got inside, it was kind of surprising. I think he was John, the guy interviewed, was maybe expecting something a little fancier, but it was kind of like worn out carpet, this sort of like fake wood paneled walls, white vinyl chairs. It was sort of like he described as like a little clubhouse. Um, Although they did have an incredible kitchen in there, apparently. That was the thing he remembered most about this hideaway, is that they had almost like a commercial scale kitchen with like a big
Wow.
stove, big burners, where they could cook big dinners for themselves. Um, so that night they went in, and the guy I interviewed, he told me they started looking around for places to put the bugs. And as I understand it, the bugs were placed above the ceiling. There's like a drop ceiling in the place. And so he goes up there to place the bugs. And the plan was to steal some electricity from the apartment itself, to
Yeah.
power the bug, and more importantly, to power the transmitter that would relay the signal to a nearby building. And he goes up there and realizes that, to your point earlier about, wires and telephone lines and things, that they had done all their own wiring up there, that nothing was up to code, and that something was supposed to be hot was ground, and something that was supposed to be ground was hot. Um, and he was afraid to touch anything, for fear of, burning the place down.
Yeah.
So once again, they had to pivot, and use a battery instead. And so that there were 2 microphones and a transmitter, both powered by so he described as like a lunch pail sized battery,
Mm.
um, which lasted a couple months, basically.
Oh,
Um,
wow. That's a long time battery.
actually, maybe it was, you actually, it would have been closer to 30 days because they ended up
Yeah.
having to go back in and replace that battery several times during the whole operation.
Okay.
Um,
Interesting.
and so they
Wow.
installed the two microphones, they swept up the wire clippings, they put the ceiling back, uh, and they left and waited to see what they would hear.
And flipped it on. Well, sat back and waited, see how good it was.
Exactly.
It's, I tell you what, it's that would have been a tense night for those guys, for those agents, a really long, tense night. And then when you get done, you're so exhilarated, like, yeah, we did it.
Right.
Be
Yeah, I
hard
have
to
to imagine
sleep
it was
for.
a moment to celebrate, but also you're just wondering, like, were we seen? Are we going to
Yeah,
go in? First thing we hear is them ripping down the ceiling tiles.
yeah.
Um,
Well, they didn't. They weren't seeing. They didn't rip down the ceiling tiles, did they? They started picking up a lot of really interesting stuff. This Angelo, he was in the mouse trap. I still can't get over the mouse trap, and we got the trap here. And what I read was they said because you come in there and you're trapped once you get in there. So maybe that's the way it was here. I got to ask around about that. We never asked about why it was called the trap, their social club. So so they're gathering all this information, they're listening, and Jello, he was, I mean, he would get mad and pop off and say things he shouldn't say out loud like that. Did they talk
mhm.
much about what they were able to hear, your agents that were monitoring that?
Yeah, so they described it. So I should say again, the project or the operation was deliberately kind of siloed, right? So I talked to folks who installed the bug. I did not actually interview anybody who had the job of monitoring day to
Oh,
day.
okay.
Um, but this was something that was covered quite well in that book, The Underbot, and the folks I interviewed were definitely, they kind of heard things around the office about what was going on, and so at first they didn't get a lot of great incriminating material, partly because I guess so. I mentioned it was Angiulo's brother, Jerry's brother Frankie, that ran a lot of the day to day operation in terms of receiving money and doing handoffs and things. And he was very quiet. He would speak in just sort of like short sentences, maybe just like a grunt of acknowledgement. And so at first they didn't really hear a lot going on. And so they kept getting approval to extend the bug, and they had to go back and change the battery again, and it went on for months. Um, and eventually they started to get really good stuff, and the whole numbers business came into focus. They could actually pick up specific amounts, that different offices were bringing in, or amounts owed in gambling debts. Um, they would also hear really interesting stuff like they would hear, so at night, often what would happen is at like 7 or 8 o'clock, the brothers would all hang out in there. And some of their lieutenants, there's this guy, Larry Zanino, who was was there a lot. Um, and Jerry would kind of hold forth and sort of talk about, in fact, they have some great, the FBI got some great quotes of just like Jerry Angiulo's musings on the life of crime, which I should try and pull up some quotes for you if um, I can look for them in a minute. But what I was going to say is that um, he would also talk about, he was incredibly aware of what the FBI was doing. So, this was a time, right around 1980, 1981, when RICO was, the Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organizations Act was just starting to be used, right? And the mafia families were kind of figuring out how this thing worked. RICO, I'm guessing many of your listeners will be familiar, but it was this very powerful law that allowed prosecutors to, bring a case against a whole family, against a whole organization, as long as they could prove that they acted as one unit, basically. And so they would hear on these tapes, the Angiulos talking about RICO, how RICO worked, what they were vulnerable to. There was this bizarre little like legal quirk at the time where in in like the federal court district that Massachusetts was in, there was this case called Turkett that had briefly that had like ruled that, a RICO case could only be brought against an organization that had infiltrated, like a mafia family that had infiltrated a legal organization like a union, for example, and that a entirely illegal business did not qualify as a for a RICO prosecution. So they're following this case. This went literally all the way to the Supreme Court in 1980, I can't, in the early 1980s. And so they were following this stuff. They're extremely tuned in to the whole legal landscape. They're incredibly paranoid about being surveilled. And yet, as far as we can tell, they never figured out that there was a listening device in that office for months. And then in many ways, the kind of the climax of this listening operation came a few months in. Angiulo was feeling paranoid about this. So they ran this card game night in addition to the numbers operation, and somebody had borrowed a few $1,000s at one of these card game nights. And Angiulo was always very careful that his family was insulated. Like at the, when you went to the Vegas night or whatever, it wasn't Mikey Angiulo or Frankie Angiulo who handed you that money that you're borrowing. It was always through somebody else. But it was Angiulo's own son who had made the mistake of personally loaning this guy thousands of dollars. And now that person couldn't pay up. And so there was this question of whether this person might flip and might testify, and it would be against Jerry's own son, right? And in fact, at one point, his son was called before a grand jury during this time, and there's this incredible wiretap, not a wire, there's a clip from the audio bug of Jerry Angiulo telling his son, like, before you were a boy, and now that you've been summoned before a grand jury, now you're a man. And so there was all this pressure swirling around them, and sort of the climax of the listening operation comes when Jerry decides that the jeopardy is just too much, and he orders a murder against this gentleman who his son had loaned the money to. And it's as clear as day, and they pick it up and it's in the transcripts, I want you to find him tonight, and so once that happens, the FBI figures that they've got a pretty solid case here.
Interesting. Now, did they go and talk to that guy and warn him off, or?
They did actually tip him off. That was a difficult call they had to make, because obviously they risked exposing the operation, but they did give that guy a heads up, and the murder was not actually carried out.
Yeah. What they probably did was said, "Hey, we have an informant that tells us that
right.
Jerry's really mad at you, and he's ordered a hit. He's put out a hit on you, trying to turn him."
Right.
And get him to talk. Now, what I read about this and what I read about this guy, he never did turn. He was not going to rat anybody out. He ended up doing 3 years, and he never ratted anybody out.
But he did survive.
Yeah. I've got some of those quotes. I tell you what, and that deal with the RICO, he said, he was talking about how, we gamble, we murder, we do this, we do that, but we don't infiltrate.
Exactly. See, I wouldn't have anything to do with illegal business for all the money in the world.
We don't infiltrate. He thought he'd be a lawyer when he came out of when he was young, and so I think he still thinks he's some kind of a half-ass lawyer. But some of the other things. When you clip the people around him first. Everybody's got a friend. He said, somebody, this thing, talking about the mafia, this thing's great. Somebody slaps your girlfriend in the mouth, we'd kill him. Don't underrate this thing. These agents used to take a quote of the day and put it in the wire room. That's what I read in the book. So
some of these were actually published in Harper's Weekly.
Oh, really?
I found this at some point. This was obviously after the prosecution. It's interesting. I feel like the FBI, this was really like it was really a win for the FBI, this whole case at the time. And so they went out of their way, I think, to publicize it. Um, and so they shared a lot of this material with the media. And so Harper's Weekly, after the case was tried, published this it's like quotes, it's like mafia wisdom according to Gennaro Angiulo. And it's a series of these quotes, exactly like reading. Things like, when a guy knocks you down, don't get back up unless he's going to kill you. You know,
Yeah,
all these great lines.
that is good. Quotes of the day. Get an email every day. Your mafia quote of the day from Gennaro Angiulo. Anyhow, so I have to ask, because John Connolly, the disgraced FBI agent, was part of this crew.
Yeah.
And I believe that other, was it John Morris, the
John
other
Morris.
agent, he was part of this crew too. And so they were talking to Whitey Bulger and Steve Fleming the whole time, getting information from them about this, that they would have had been feeding them information to, about, I think they even drew them a description of the inside of the trap, the mouse trap.
Right.
So that's kind of, you hate to take anything away from the FBI, but they were.
Well, that's why I said at the time, this was a real success story for the FBI. But now, looking back now, it's a lot more muddled.
Yeah.
Because exactly as you say, we had no idea in the mid 1980s that some of the lead agents on this case had not only cultivated Whitey Bulger as an informant, but really had been cultivated themselves, and that they were taking bribes from Whitey Bulger and protecting him. And so, here's what I'll say about that. In some ways, it's hard to actually say how important Whitey Bulger was to making the case against the Angiulos. He had been an informant since the 1970s, we now know. He did visit 98 Prince Street on instructions from Connolly shortly before the bug was placed in order to gather intelligence. We know that he provided, like you said, a hand-drawn floor plan of the office. But something that's come out in the reporting since is that in some ways, Connolly and Morris, the now disgraced FBI agents, were actually working to insert Bulger into the Angiulo case in order to justify protecting him. And so in some way, it's a little hard to tell now which way it was working. Like, was Bulger actually providing important information in order to bring down his rival, or were these FBI agents kind of inflating Bulger's importance to the case so that they could continue to, so he could continue to maintain this kind of status as a prized informant? And it's a little hard to say now. It's all muddled. But it certainly does color how you look at the whole case when you understand that some of the lead agents on it were working for Whitey Bulger. One especially, there's one story of after Gennaro Angiulo was arrested and after, his offices were raided, that agent you mentioned, John Morris, went to visit Whitey Bulger and he brought along the cassette tapes of, all this stuff they had recorded in the bug. And you can hear in there Jerry Angiulo bragging, and he's talking trash about Whitey Bulger. And so the agent and the gangster, they had a couple bottles of wine. They listened to these tapes together and just, toasted to Jerry Angiulo's misfortune.
Well, I hadn't heard that one before. That's a good one.
Yeah, apparently Morris got so drunk that night that Whitey Bulger had to drive him home in his own government-issued car. So I know what that says about the state of the case at that moment.
Well, it beats my story. I heard about a guy that had his girlfriend drive him home in his government car one night.
How about a notorious mobster, one of the FBI's most wanted men, driving you home in your government-issued car?
All right, Ian Koss. Ian, this is great. This has been wonderful. That's a great story. I've never covered this area of the mob before, and I've always wanted to. I just never seemed to get around to it. I've done Patriarcha, of course, but
Mhm.
never got down into Boston. Now I know why, because they were really almost like a big crew under Patriarcha,
Sure.
and now I know why that is. Why I always wondered why the Italians didn't have a much stronger presence in Boston, but so now we know, guys. This has been great. And now, what is going to be the name of this podcast?
Yeah, so the show is called Scratch and Win. It
Scratch and
comes
Win.
out on January 29th, and it'll be an 8-part series. And like I said, it really follows the rise of the modern state lottery and how those state lotteries set out to compete with organized crime to take over gambling. So we cover the origin of the scratch ticket, which was actually first marketed and sold in Massachusetts. We cover the rise of the state-run numbers games, lotto-style games, all that. Those years in the 70s and 80s when it was basically like state bureaucrats and mafia bookmakers going head to head over gambling. That's the story we know.
It really sounds interesting. I'm looking forward to that. So, guys, I'll see. I probably won't put this out till after this is out, so I'll make sure there's a link in the show notes to the podcast that Scratch to Win. It's really sounds interesting, Ian. I really appreciate you coming on the show. And has that been your career, podcasting? You in print journalism for a while, or?
I've actually never worked in print. I'm a audio only, audio first guy. So
All right.
it,
Well, the new
it,
generation here. All right,
yeah, thank
guys.
you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure. And
All right.
you come on over, check it out, Scratch and Win. It's from GBH News in Boston. And yeah, if you like what you heard, there's a lot more of that.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ian.
All right, you have a good one.
Okay. Bye. Well, guys, be sure and check that podcast out. A really interesting subject, and they really go into it in depth. And I always wondered about that the kind of the mafia and the numbers game and the lotto and sports bookmaking, and now it's all legal, and that transition, and it's still transitioning, at least in Missouri. We're just got the app, and so we still have mafia bookmakers here, and I imagine we're always going to have mafia bookmakers. I think the numbers game probably didn't last against the state lottery, because you could get such a huge, you get $100 million jackpot, $1 billion jackpot. They had one recently, and there's no mob family going to ever have anything like that. Hell, they got $1 billion jackpot. They just take that $1 billion and run. That's what I'd do anyhow. So don't forget, I like to ride motorcycles. Watch out for motorcycles when you're out there, although it's so cold today. It's about 0 here in Kansas City today. Ain't no motorcycle riding today. If you got a problem with PTSD and you've been in the service, be sure and go to the VA website and get that hotline number. And if you have a problem with drugs or alcohol, our friend Anthony Ruggiano is down in Florida, and he's a drug and alcohol counselor. He's also got a hotline number on his website, Anthony Ruggiano, reformmobsters.com or something like that. You can find it. And if you have any trouble, get hold of me. And if you go take treatment from Anthony, get hold of me. I'm sure curious what it's like. So we're talking about gambling. There's 1-800 bets off, at least around here, and there's always a gambling interest. Always have to put money into recovery efforts for people who have problems, gambling addiction problems. So if you ever think you have that problem, there's always somewhere in your state there's going to be a hotline, or there's going to be money available for help with gambling addiction problems. I got movies and books and everything out there, so I don't need to go down that whole laundry list. You can rent my movies on Amazon, and you can find the names of them on my website, Gangland Wire. I got links to all that in the show notes. Doing these books on my podcast episodes. I got one on Chicago out. I got one on New York out. I'm going to start working on a book about my life and my career, I guess. I don't know. My kids are after me. They want to read it. I don't know. I don't really find it all that interesting, but but maybe I'll keep pecking away at it and I'll get it done. I have been at least witness to a lot of interesting things in the criminal world over my lifetime. So thanks a lot, guys.